April 1943. Fleet Radio Unit Pacific Pearl Harbor. The cryptographers, a pencil moved across paper. As intercepted Japanese naval characters transformed into English text, the message originated from Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet Inspection Tour Schedule for Admiral Yamamoto detailed itinerary, including exact arrival times at forward bases departure 0600 hours, Tokyo time. April 18th from Rabaul arrival Bolloré Airfield 0800 hours, Tokyo time transport via 2 Type 1 medium bombers escort. Complement 60 fighters Technical Sergeant Harold Fudena, a Nisei translator with the Military Intelligence Service double-checked his translation against the original cipher. The precision of Japanese military planning had provided extraordinary detail. Exact times, specific aircraft types, precise routes. Commander William Goggins, directing FRUP-AC operations, immediately recognized the message's significance within minutes. The decoded intelligence was in the hands of Commander Edwin Layton. Pacific Fleet Intelligence Officer Layton's eyes widened as he absorbed the implications Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, would be within range of American fighters for exactly one opportunity. What none of them knew was that this single decoded message would trigger the most audacious fighter interception in aviation history. The Pacific War had taught American forces that individual Japanese commanders were not just military leaders. They were symbols. Kill the symbol, and you shatter morale across an entire fleet. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto represented more than naval leadership. Harvard-educated, widely traveled poker playing. Yamamoto understood America better than any Japanese commander. His warnings about American industrial capacity had been ignored. His reluctance to wage war against the United States had been overruled. Yet once committed, he had orchestrated Pearl Harbor with mathematical precision, achieved tactical victories in the early Pacific campaigns, and nearly delivered decisive triumph at Midway before American codebreakers turned the tide. The Lockheed P-38 Greaves Lightning sat on the tarmac at Fighter Strip No. 4 Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Twin Allison V-1710-89/91 engines, capable of pushing the aircraft to 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Twin booms, extending behind the engines, connected by a horizontal stabilizer spanning 52 feet. Central nacelle housing pilot, an armament for Browning A&M 250 caliber machine guns, and one Hispano M 220mm cannon clustered in the nose, eliminating the convergence problems of wing-mounted weapons with 2 external 165-gallon drop tanks. Supplementing the 300-gallon internal capacity, the Lightning could achieve a combat radius exceeding 450 miles. No other American fighter in the Pacific theater could match that range. Major John William Mitchell stood in the operations dugout studying weather reports and intelligence updates. Commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron, 347th Fighter Group, Mitchell had logged over 2,000 flight hours in everything from basic trainers to the latest fighters. His mind processed the tactical problem within the precision of a navigation computer. Distance from Guadalcanal to intercept point 435 miles direct. But direct flight would take them over Japanese-held islands bristling with radar installations and coastwatcher observer posts. The indirect route, swinging far out to sea before turning north, added 165 miles total distance, outbound 600 miles, return distance 400 miles, 1,000 miles total, with fuel reserves for perhaps 7 minutes of combat at war. Emergency power. The mathematics were unforgiving. Standard P-38G internal fuel capacity, 300 gallons in main tanks, 60 gallons in reserve tanks. 2 165-gallon drop tanks added 330 gallons total, fuel 690 gallons. Maximum consumption at cruise, approximately 50 gallons per hour, per engine at low altitude, increasing with altitude and power settings. Flying time, available just over 5 hours and 45 minutes under ideal conditions. Required flying time for the mission 4 hours and 30 minutes, minimum, assuming perfect navigation and no delays. The margin error was essentially zero when accounting for combat maneuvering and potential headwinds. Captain Thomas George Lansfield Jr. had studied the mission profile until every detail was burned into his memory. son of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Lanphier SR, a decorated World War I aviator who had served on General Billy Mitchell's staff. The younger Lanphier possessed both the tactical skills and political instincts that would shape his future. 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with the confident bearing of a natural leader, he had already claimed 5 aerial victories, though some were disputed. His aggressive flying style and talent for self-promotion had earned him both admirers and detractors within the squadron. At 27 years old, Lanphier saw the Yamamoto mission as his ticket to fame and post-war political success. First Lieutenant Rex Theodore Barber represented a different archetype of American fighter pilot, Oregon farm boy from Culver, Oregon State College engineering student before enlisting in September 1940. Barber flew with mechanical precision and quiet competence where Lanphier sought glory. Barber sought efficiency. His confirmed aerial victories had been achieved through careful positioning and accurate gunnery rather than spectacular aerobatics. At 25 years old, he had developed the ability to visualize 3-dimensional combat geometry with remarkable clarity. His methodical approach to aerial combat reflected his engineering background, every action calculated, every risk assessed. Every shot carefully aimed aboard Mitsubishi G4M1, Type 1 bomber number 323, at Lacuna Airfield. Raybal Admiral Yamamoto reviewed the inspection schedule with his staff. The Betty bomber, as Americans called it, represented both Japanese ingenuity and compromise. Exceptional range of 2,850 miles, achieved through minimal armor protection and lack of self-sealing fuel tanks. Maximum speed of 265 miles per hour at 19,685 feet. Cruise speed of 200 miles per hour. The aircraft's vulnerability had earned it the nickname Hamachi cigar, or Type 1 lighter, among Japanese crews, a grim reference to its tendency to burst into flames when hit. But for this mission, 6A6M3 model 32-0 fighters from the 200th Air Group would provide escort protection. Yamamoto, at 59 years old, remained Japan's most formidable strategic thinker. Born Isoroku Takano, later adopted into the Yamamoto family. He stood 5 feet 3 inches tall, but carried himself with the dignity expected of a samurai descendant. His left hand bore evidence of combat at the Battle of Tsushima Strait on May 1905. The index and middle fingers lost to Russian shrapnel when a gun turret exploded aboard the armored cruiser Nishin. The injury had never diminished his passion for calligraphy, his skill at poker, or his ability to command respect through sheer force of personality. During his time at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, he had hitchhiked across America, observing automobile factories in Detroit, oil refineries in Texas, aircraft manufacturing plants in California. The experience had convinced him that war with America was ultimately unwinnable, a conviction he expressed in his famous quote about running wild for 6 months before inevitable defeat. The American plan depended on signals intelligence maintaining absolute secrecy. If Japanese naval command suspected their codes were compromised, they would cancel Yamamoto's flight or alter the schedule. The cryptanalysis team at Station Hypo, now redesignated as Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, had been breaking JN-25 variants since before the Battle of Midway. Their ability to read Japanese naval traffic had become increasingly sophisticated, progressing from partial decrypts to nearly complete message recovery. But each decoded message risked revealing American capabilities. The decision to act on the Yamamoto intercept had required approval from Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral William Bull Halsey, commander of the South Pacific Area, Rear Admiral Mark Mitchell, Commander Air Solomons, and ultimately President Franklin Roosevelt himself, who allegedly gave the simple order, "Get Yamamoto." The intercept planning fell to multiple officers working in coordination. Marine Major John Cundon, operations officer for Commander Aircraft Solomons, created the initial flight plan, calculating fuel consumption and navigation waypoints. His plan was reviewed and discarded by Mitchell, who found the air speeds and timing estimates unsuitable for the P-38's capabilities. Mitchell recalculated everything from scratch, working with his pilots through the night to develop a plan that maximized their chances while minimizing detection risk. The final route consisted of 5 precisely calculated legs, each designed to avoid Japanese radar coverage while accounting for wind drift and magnetic deviation. Intelligence analysis suggested multiple factors favoring the mission. The date, April 18th, marked exactly 1 year since the Doolittle Raid on Tokyo, providing symbolic significance. Weather forecasts indicated favorable conditions with scattered clouds and good visibility. Most critically, the Japanese appeared to have no suspicion that their codes were compromised. Radio traffic analysis showed normal operational patterns with no indication of increased security measures. The element of surprise, if achieved, would be total. The Zero escort presented a formidable challenge that occupied much of the mission. Planning the Mitsubishi A6M3 Model 320 possessed superior maneuverability. To the P-38 at medium and low altitudes, maximum speed of 336 miles per hour at 19,685 feet, climb rate of 3,100 feet per minute, and the ability to turn inside any American fighter with a turning radius of less than 1,000 feet. But the Zero achieved these capabilities through radical weight reduction. Empty weight of only 3,980 pounds compared to the P-38's 12,780 pounds, no armor. Protection for the pilot beyond a single 55mm thick piece of bulletproof glass, no self-sealing fuel tanks, making it vulnerable to incendiary ammunition, structural strength calculated to the absolute minimum requirements in a turning dogfight below 20,000 feet. The Zero would destroy a P-38, but in a high-speed diving attack utilizing superior firepower and structural strength. The Lightning held decisive advantages. Lieutenant Bessie Frank Holmes had analyzed Zero combat tactics. Throughout his tour in the Solomons, the Japanese pilots typically maintained close escort formation, positioning themselves 1,000 to 1,500 feet above, and slightly behind the bombers in 2-3 plane Shotai formations. Standard doctrine called for the escorts to immediately engage any attacking fighters, while the bombers continued to their destination, relying on speed and defensive armament for protection. But American intelligence had noticed a pattern when caught by surprise. Japanese formations often reacted slowly to attacks from unexpected angles, particularly from below and behind. The key would be achieving complete tactical surprise, despite approaching across 600 miles of open ocean in broad daylight. April 17, 1943. The mission briefing began at 200 hours in the packed operations tent. Rear Admiral Mark Mitchell, Commander, Air Solomons, personally addressed the assembled pilots, known for his advocacy of naval aviation and his command of USS Hornet during the Doolittle Raid exactly 1 year earlier. Mitchell understood the mission's significance. 18 P-38s would participate in the operation. 4 aircraft, designated as the killer flight, would attack the bombers directly. 12 aircraft would provide top cover against the anticipated response from Cahill Airfield's 75 Zero fighters. 2 additional aircraft would serve as spares in case of mechanical failures. The pilots selected for the killer flight: Captain Lanphier, Lieutenant Barber, Lieutenant Holmes, and Lieutenant Raymond K. Heine. The spare pilots, Lieutenants James McLahan and Joe Moore. Mitchell's navigation plan reflected both brilliance and necessity, born from extensive overwater navigation experience. Leg 1 magnetic heading, 265 degrees for 55 minutes at 30 to 50 feet altitude, covering 183 miles. Leg 2 heading, 290 degrees for 27 minutes, covering 89 miles. Leg 3 heading, 305 degrees for 38 minutes, covering 125 miles. Leg 4 heading, 330 degrees for 16 minutes, covering 52 miles. Leg 5 heading, 290 degrees for 21 minutes, covering 70 miles, while climbing to attack altitude. Each leg calculated to avoid Japanese observation posts on New Georgia, Vela, LA, Vela, and the Treasury Islands, while compensating for forecast wind drift. No margin existed for navigation error. A deviation of 1 degree sustained over the distance would put them miles off course, with insufficient fuel to search for the target. The pilot's survival equipment reflected the mission's desperate nature, made West life preservers in case of water landing, though. Survival chances in shark-infested waters were minimal. Jungle survival kits, containing water purification tablets, emergency rations, fishing line, and basic medical supplies for bailouts over Bougainville. Each pilot carried a Colt M1911A 145 caliber pistol with extra magazines, knowing that capture meant certain execution. Japanese treatment of downed American aviators had become increasingly brutal as the war progressed. Intelligence reports from rescued prisoners described beheadings, medical experiments without anesthesia, and confirmed cases of cannibalism. The pilots understood that running out of fuel over water meant almost certain death from exposure, or sharks. Mechanical failure over Japanese territory meant something worse. Lieutenant Colonel Luther S. Moore, the weather officer, reviewed meteorological data one final time. Surface winds from the southeast at 8 knots. Winds at 5,000 feet from the south at 15 knots. Winds at 10,000 feet from the southwest at 22 knots. Tropical weather patterns in the Solomon Islands were notoriously unpredictable. A storm system developing anywhere along the route could doom the mission. Even unexpected headwinds might leave the P-38's without sufficient fuel to return. The meteorologist estimated a 70% probability of favorable conditions, but everyone understood that weather in the Solomon Islands could change within minutes. Towering cumulus clouds could develop from clear skies in less than an hour. Radio silence would be absolute until contact with the enemy. The P-38's CR-274N radio sets had been specially tuned to frequency 6710 kilocycles, unlikely to be monitored by Japanese listening posts. But any transmission risked alerting enemy forces. Mitchell would navigate for the entire formation using dead reckoning compass, airspeed indicator clock, and mental calculation. No radio beacons to confirm position. No landmarks over the endless Pacific swells, except occasional islands that had to be avoided. One man's navigation skills would determine whether 18 aircraft found a target or disappeared into the vast Pacific. Lieutenant Julius Jack Jacobson checked his aircraft's weapons. One final time, the 4 Browning A&M 250 caliber machine guns each carried 500 rounds of M2 ball, M1 incendiary, and M2 armor-piercing ammunition in linked belts. Rate of fire, 750 to 850 rounds per minute per gun. The 20mm Hispano M2 cannon carried 150 rounds of high explosive and armor-piercing shells. The concentrated firepower in the P-38's nose created a convergence zone of destruction that could soar through a bomber's wing spar in seconds. But ammunition consumption at maximum rate meant less than 37 seconds of firing time for the machine guns, and less than 12 seconds for the cannon. Every burst had to count in the pre-dawn darkness of April. Ground crews performed final preparations under the supervision of their crew chiefs. Master Sergeant Leo B. Godfrey supervised the arming crews, ensuring every round was properly seated and every belt correctly aligned. Fuel tanks topped off to absolute capacity with 100-octane aviation gasoline. Internal tanks filled to 360 gallons. Drop tanks, verified at 160 gallons each. Ammunition belts loaded with the prescribed mixture of ball armor-piercing and incendiary rounds in a 4:1:1 ratio. Drop tank attachments checked and rechecked. A mechanical failure in a single shackle could abort an aircraft's participation, or worse, cause a tank to hang up and create fatal drag oil levels. Verified. Hydraulic pressures checked. Control surfaces inspected for full range of motion. The Japanese Navy's 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul operated under strict protocols for high-ranking officer transport. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commander of the Southeast Area Fleet, and Yamamoto's subordinate, had argued against the inspection tour. American fighter activity had increased dramatically around Bougainville. Following the Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal in February, intelligence reports suggested the Americans had nearly 200 fighters operating from Guadalcanal, the Russell Islands, and other forward bases. But Yamamoto insisted on personally congratulating the pilots of Operation I-Go, the recent Japanese air offensive that claimed dramatically inflated victories against American shipping. Reports of 1 cruiser, 2 destroyers, and 25 transports sunk when actual losses were 1 destroyer, 1 corvette, 1 tanker, and 2 cargo ships. Chief Petty Officer Hiroshi Hayashi supervised the preparation of Yamamoto's aircraft at Lacuna Airfield. Betty Bomber Tail number 323 from the 700th Air Group had been selected for its excellent maintenance record and reliable engines. The aircraft had completed 47 combat missions without significant mechanical failure. Additional fuel tanks had been installed in the bomb bay to ensure adequate reserves. The admiral's seat had been positioned on the left side behind the pilot, providing the best view for aerial observation. A special mounting had been installed for Yamamoto's personal katana sword, a family heirloom dating to the 16th century Mahoyama period. The escort fighters came from the 200th Air Group, an elite unit with extensive combat experience over the Solomons. The 6 pilots selected averaged over 500 combat hours each. Among them was Petty Officer First Class Shoichi Sugita, who would later become one of Japan's leading aces with over 70 victories before his death in April 1945. Also flying escort was Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yanagir, a 100-mission veteran who felt deeply honored to protect the combined fleet commander. They had faced American P-38s, P-39s, P-40s, and F-4F Wildcats in numerous engagements. The lightning speed advantage diminished below 15,000 feet due to compressibility effects and the Zero's superior power-to-weight ratio at low altitudes. Its turning radius at low altitude exceeded the Zero's by a factor of 2 in a low-altitude turning engagement. The Zero pilots believed they would hold every advantage except firepower and armor. Protection at 0725 hours local time, 0525 Tokyo time, on April. Mitchell's P-38s began taking off from fighter strip Noman 2 at Henderson Field. The takeoff sequence had been carefully orchestrated to minimize time and fuel consumption. Mitchell led the procession, followed by his flight of 3. Then Lanphier's killer flight. Then the cover flights. Lieutenant McLarenahan's aircraft suffered a blown tire on takeoff. Roll the P-38 skidding off the runway in a cloud of coral dust and tearing off the right wheel. He was unhurt, but eliminated from the mission. Lieutenant Joe Moore's fuel transfer pump failed during climb out, preventing him from accessing his drop tank fuel, forcing him to return immediately. 16 P-38s continued the mission. 2 fewer than planned. The margin for error, already razor-thin, had diminished further. Mitchell led the formation at exactly 30 to 50 feet above the water. To avoid Japanese radar detection, salt spray coated the windscreens within minutes, requiring frequent clearing. The pilots flew in radio silence, maintaining position through visual reference alone. Each pilot fought his own battle against monotony and fatigue. 2 hours and 5 minutes of formation, flying at extreme low altitude, constantly adjusting throttles to maintain position, scanning engine instruments while avoiding spatial disorientation. The Pacific swells rolled beneath them in endless succession, hypnotic in their regularity. Several pilots later reported fighting drowsiness, using various techniques from slapping their own faces to singing loudly to maintain alertness. The sun blazed through the plexiglass canopies, turning the cockpits into ovens. Despite the slipstream, Lieutenant Roger J. Ames, flying in the cover flight, monitored his fuel consumption with growing concern. The drag from his drop tanks exceeded calculations, possibly due to improper attachment angle or manufacturing variations at current consumption rates. He would have perhaps 5 minutes of reserve fuel upon return. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. Burn too much fuel outbound, and they wouldn't make it home. Conserve too much, and they might lack the power for combat maneuvering. Each pilot made continuous micro-adjustments to propeller pitch and throttle settings, balancing mission requirements against survival probability. The Allison engines droned steadily, their synchronized sound becoming almost hypnotic over the hours at 0600 hours. Tokyo time, 0800 local. Yamamoto's 2-bomber formation departed Rabaul exactly on schedule. The Admiral wore his dress white uniform with full decorations, including the Order of the Chrysanthemum and the Order of the Golden Kite, intending to impress the forward area troops with Imperial Navy prestige. His mood was reportedly somber. Several staff officers later testified that he seemed to have premonitions about the flight. Vice Admiral Motomugaki Yamamoto's chief of staff and close friend occupied Betty Bomber number 326, along with several staff officers. The formation climbed to 6,500 feet. The escorts taking position into 3-plane flights. Visibility was excellent, with scattered cumulus clouds at 4,000 to 5,000 feet, providing occasional concealment. Warrant Officer Kenji Yanagira, flying escort in Zero Tail number 3081, scanned the sky in prescribed patterns drilled into him through years of training. 3 years of combat had developed his instincts to near supernatural levels. He could identify aircraft types at distances where other pilots saw only specks. His peripheral vision could detect the slightest movement against cloud backgrounds. Yet on this morning, his attention focused primarily on maintaining precise formation position. The flight from Rabaul to Balala had been completed dozens of times without incident, American fighters had never penetrated this. Far north in strength, the greatest danger seemed to be operational accidents rather than enemy action at 0934 hours local time. Mitchell's formation reached the final navigation turn. Point precisely on schedule, they had been airborne for 2 hours and 9 minutes, flying entirely by dead reckoning over trackless ocean. Mitchell checked his specially synchronized Elgin watch against his calculated position. If his navigation was correct, they should turn northwest now for the intercept. If he had made any error in wind calculation or compass heading, they would miss the target entirely. He waggled his wings, signaling the turn, and 16 P-38s banked in unison toward Bougainville. The timing was extraordinary. They were exactly 1 minute ahead of the planned intercept, time having covered 410 miles of open ocean navigation with only compass clock and airspeed indicator. Lieutenant Douglas S. Canning, flying as Mitchell's wingman in the number 2 position, was the first to spot the target bogies. 11 o'clock high. He called at 0934, breaking radio silence. For the first time, the range was approximately 5 miles altitude differential. 6,000 feet, 8 aircraft in perfect formation, exactly where they were supposed to be. Mitchell felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with amazement. They had found the proverbial needle in the Pacific haystack. 2 Betty bombers in echelon formation and 6 o'clock fighters in 2 flights of 3, completely unaware of the 16 P-38s climbing toward them from below and behind. Mitchell immediately ordered the drop tanks jettisoned. Skin them. Tanks, all flights. Let's get them. 16 165-gallon tanks tumbled toward the ocean as the P-38s shed their drag-inducing burden. Engines were pushed to war emergency power, delivering 1,475 horsepower per engine. The Lightnings accelerated through 300 miles per hour, climbing at maximum sustainable rate of 2,800 feet per minute. The killer flight would execute the attack while Mitchell led the cover flight higher to intercept any fighters from Hilly. Captain Lanphier saw the escort Zeros begin to react. They had spotted the approaching P-38s and were dropping their own belly tanks, peeling off to engage standard Zero doctrine. Protect the bombers by intercepting the attackers. Lanphier made an instant tactical decision that would later generate decades of controversy. Instead of continuing toward the bombers with Barber, he turned to engage the diving Zeros head on his head, reasoning, as he would later claim, eliminate the escort threat to allow Barber a clear attack run. His critics would argue he was glory hunting, seeking easier fighter kills over the primary target. Lieutenant Barber maintained his course toward the bombers, now diving desperately toward the jungle canopy. The lead Betty had nosed over into a steep dive, the pilot attempting to reach treetop level, where the P-38 speed advantage would be minimized and the jungle would provide cover. Barber pushed his Lightning into a 45-degree dive, airspeed indicator climbing past 400 miles per hour. The distance closed rapidly. 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,000 at 500 yards. Barber opened fire with all weapons. 4 streams of 50 caliber bullets and 20 millimeter cannon shells converged on the bomber's right engine and wing root. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Betty's right engine exploded in orange flames, the wing spar severed by concentrated fire. The bomber rolled violently to the left, completely out of control. Barber pulled up hard to avoid collision, his P-38 groaning under the G-forces, glimpsing the Betty's fuselage disappearing into the jungle canopy. Trailing fire and debris, a black column of smoke marked the impact. Point 1 bomber down, but which one carried Yamamoto? Barber had no way to know. As he searched for the second bomber, Holmes and Heine had followed Barber initially, but became separated in the violent maneuvering. Holmes spotted the second Betty low over the water, racing south along the Bougainville coastline at maximum speed. Vice Admiral Ugaki's pilot had chosen a different escape route, diving for the ocean rather than the jungle, hoping to use the water's surface to prevent attacks from below. Holmes rolled into attack position, but his closure rate was excessive. He fired a long burst that damaged the Betty's right engine, producing a white vapor trail of leaking fuel and oil, but overshot before achieving decisive damage. Barber acquired the second bomber after Holmes's pass. The Betty was barely 50 feet above the waves, its damaged engine trailing smoke. Barber lined up for a deflection shot, leading the target by 30 degrees to account for its speed. His first burst walked across the water, sending up geysers of spray, then climbed up into the bomber's fuselage. Large pieces of metal skin peeled away, some striking Barber's P-38. With audible impacts, the Betty's left engine caught fire. The pilot attempted a controlled water landing, but hit the ocean at over 100 miles per hour. The aircraft broke apart. On impact, the fuselage separating from the wings. Meanwhile, Lanphier engaged the escort Zeros in a violent vertical scissors maneuver. His P-38's superior speed allowed him to maintain energy, while the lighter Zeros relied on their turning ability. Lanphier claimed to have shot down one Zero during this engagement, describing how he rolled inverted and fired into its wing roots, causing it to explode. However, Japanese records show no escort fighters were lost. The remaining Zeros, led by Warrant Officer Yamamoto, focused on driving off the American fighters rather than pursuing decisive engagement. Their primary mission, protecting the bombers, had already failed catastrophically. The top cover flight, led by Mitchell, watched for fighters from Kahili Airfield, located just 20 miles from the intercept point. The expected swarm of 75 Zeros never materialized. Either surprise was complete, or the Japanese fighters were committed elsewhere. Mitchell maintained altitude advantage at 18,000 feet, ready to dive on any climbing interceptors below him. The killer flight completed their attacks and turned for home. The entire engagement had lasted less than 10 minutes. Time over. Target perhaps 3 minutes of actual combat. The mission's success would depend on which bomber had carried Yamamoto. Lieutenant Barber's P-38 had sustained significant damage during the engagement. His aircraft bore 104 bullet holes from return fire by the bomber's 77mm Type 92 defensive machine guns, and possibly from Zero fighters. Hydraulic fluid leaked from punctured lines, leaving reddish streaks along the fuselage. One engine ran rough, possibly from debris ingestion or battle damage, but both Allison engines continued to function, and the Lightning remained controllable. Barber began the long flight home, constantly monitoring engine temperatures and fuel consumption. Every unusual vibration might signal impending engine failure. Over 400 miles of hostile ocean. The return flight tested every pilot's endurance and skill. Fuel reserves were critically low for several aircraft. Lieutenant Holmes experienced engine problems that forced him to reduce power. Falling behind, the formation radio discipline was partially maintained despite the temptation to coordinate or call for help. Each pilot was alone with his calculations, estimating whether remaining fuel would carry him home. The mathematics of survival played out in 16 cockpits simultaneously as they approached the Russell Islands, approximately 200 miles from home. Several pilots faced critical decisions. Lieutenant Hines' fuel gauges showed dangerously low levels. Rather than risk ditching at sea, he could attempt landing at the emergency strip on Bannock Island, but Japanese submarines had been reported in the area, and rescue was uncertain. He chose to continue trusting his calculations and the reliability of the Allison engines. Mitchell's navigation on the return leg proved equally precise. The scattered P-38s gradually reformed as they approached Guadalcanal at 12:30 hours local time. Fighter Strip 2 appeared ahead, exactly where expected. Several aircraft were operating on fumes. Holmes landed with both engines sputtering, his fuel tanks essentially dry. Others landed with less than 10 gallons remaining, perhaps 3 minutes of flight time. The margin between triumph and disaster had been measured in gallons of gasoline. As the pilots shut down their engines, ground crews immediately swarmed the aircraft, counting bullet holes and assessing damage. The immediate question on everyone's: had they succeeded? Which bomber carried Yamamoto? The pilots could only report 2 bombers destroyed, but target identification had been impossible. During the fierce combat, intelligence officers would have to wait for Japanese reaction to determine the mission's true outcome. The wait would prove agonizing. That evening, as tropical darkness fell over Guadalcanal, the pilots gathered in the officers' club, a ramshackle structure of salvaged lumber and captured Japanese materials. Captain Lanphier, ever conscious of publicity, immediately began promoting his version of events. He claimed to have shot down Yamamoto's bomber after a spectacular vertical reversal maneuver, rolling inverted and firing into the bomber from above his account would have required him to be in two places simultaneously engaging Zeros, while also attacking bombers. Lieutenant Barber quietly disputed this version, describing his straightforward stern attack on the lead bomber. Japanese search parties found Admiral Yamamoto's crashed bomber. The following day, April, the wreckage was scattered through dense jungle, approximately 4 miles inland from Moila Point, near the village of Aku on Bougainville. The search was led by Lieutenant Commander Tabuchi Shigeru of the 26th Air Flotilla. Yamamoto's body was discovered thrown clear of the main wreckage, but still strapped in his aircraft seat. He maintained a dignified posture, even in death, his white-gloved hands still clutching his ceremonial sword. Medical examination by Dr. Tanaka revealed 2 gunshot wounds. 1 bullet had entered below his left shoulder blade, exiting above his right eye. Another had struck his jaw. Death had been instantaneous, probably during Barbara's initial firing pass. The psychological impact on the Japanese Navy was devastating beyond calculation. Yamamoto was not merely a fleet commander, but the embodiment of Japanese naval tradition and strategic thinking. His understanding of combined fleet operations was unmatched. His ability to inspire loyalty among subordinates was legendary. His realistic assessment of American capabilities had provided the only check on Japanese strategic overreach. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, one of Yamamoto's staff officers, who survived the second bomber's crash with severe injuries, later described the admiral's death as the void that could never be filled. Watanabe had been playing shogi with Yamamoto just the night before, and the admiral had seemed unusually fatalistic. Japanese naval intelligence immediately suspected the Americans had broken their codes. The precision of the intercept, arriving at exactly the right place and time, after a 600-mile flight, seemed impossible through coincidence. The timing, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle Raid, suggested deliberate planning. But acknowledging code compromise would require admitting a catastrophic intelligence failure that could affect ongoing operations. Instead, Japanese authorities claimed Yamamoto had died while directing forward operations, maintaining the fiction that his death occurred during routine combat rather than targeted assassination. The American reaction was initially subdued due to security concerns. If the Japanese confirmed that codes were compromised, the intelligence advantage that had proved decisive at Midway and enabled the Yamamoto mission would be lost. President Roosevelt received the news with grim satisfaction, but ordered absolute secrecy. Admiral Nimitz worried that publicity might reveal American code-breaking capabilities. For over a month, the American public remained unaware that Yamamoto was dead, let alone that American fighters had killed him. The controversy over who shot down Yamamoto began immediately upon landing and would poison relationships for decades. Captain Lanphier, ever conscious of publicity value, aggressively promoted his claim. His account, which evolved and became more elaborate over time, described performing an extreme vertical rolling inverted and firing into the bomber's wing root from above. This version of events would have required Lanphier to violate the laws of physics, being in two places simultaneously while performing maneuvers that exceeded the P-38's capabilities. Lieutenant Barber's account was more modest and consistent with physical evidence. He described a straightforward stern chase and attack on the lead bomber, followed by a separate attack on the second bomber. Japanese witnesses, including Zero pilot Yanagir, interviewed after the war, confirmed seeing only one P-38 attack the lead bomber, approaching from behind and below, exactly as Barbara described. The angle of bullet impacts on Yamamoto's body, entering from below and behind, matched Barbara's attack geometry perfectly. The distribution of bullet holes in the wreckage was consistent with fire from behind and below, not from above. The dispute would continue for decades, poisoning relationships among the mission participants. In October 1943, an issue of Time magazine featured an article about the mission and mentioned Lanphier by name, nearly compromising operational security. The Air Force officially credited both Lanphier and Barber with half a kill each in 1991. A political compromise that satisfied no one. In 2003, after extensive analysis of Japanese records, crash site evidence, and witness testimony, historians concluded that Barber alone was responsible for shooting down Yamamoto. Major Mitchell, who had led the mission with extraordinary skill, received the Navy Cross rather than the Medal of Honor originally recommended. The security breach caused by premature publicity had angered Navy leadership. Every pilot on the mission received the Navy Cross recognition of the operation's exceptional danger and importance. But Mitchell's extraordinary navigation, finding a moving target after 600 miles of dead reckoning, deserved greater recognition than inter-service politics allowed. The technical lessons from Operation Vengeance influenced American fighter development throughout the war. The P-38's unique combination of range, firepower, and speed had proved decisive. No other American fighter could have executed this mission. The Lightning's twin-engine reliability had brought damaged aircraft home when single-engine fighters would have been lost. The concentrated nose armament had achieved instant, devastating effects that wing-mounted guns could never match. These lessons would influence the development of long-range escort fighters like the P-51D Mustang. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from Yamamoto's loss. His successor, Admiral Minichi Koga, lacked Yamamoto's strategic vision and charismatic leadership. Koga would die in a plane crash less than a year later, in March 1944, another blow to Japanese naval leadership. The Japanese Navy's subsequent operations reflected increasingly desperate tactics rather than coherent strategy. The decisive battle Yamamoto had sought to orchestrate a single engagement to destroy American carrier forces would never materialize. Instead, Japanese naval aviation died through attrition in the Marianas Turkey Shoot, and the Battle of Later Gulf. The psychological impact extended beyond military implications. Yamamoto had been portrayed in Japanese propaganda as invincible, the supreme naval strategist who would lead Japan to inevitable victory. His death shattered this mythology. If Yamamoto could be hunted down and killed, what did that say about Japan's prospects? Morale throughout the Japanese military began a decline that would accelerate with each subsequent defeat. Victory disease that had infected Japanese strategic thinking after early successes gave way to desperate fatalism. American code-breaking capabilities continued to provide decisive advantages throughout the Pacific War. The Japanese never fully acknowledged that their codes were compromised, making only incremental improvements rather than wholesale changes. This intelligence blindness cost them dearly at the Philippine Sea, where American fighters decimated Japanese naval aviation in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The ability to read enemy intentions transformed American defensive operations into carefully orchestrated ambushes. The human cost of Yamamoto's death extended to those who flew the mission. Lieutenant Raymond Heine was later lost in action, never returning from a subsequent mission. Captain Lanphier left the military after the war to pursue politics and business trading on his claimed role in killing Yamamoto. Despite the disputed nature of his account, Lieutenant Barber remained in the Air Force, retiring as a colonel in 1961. His modesty preventing him from fully challenging Lanphier's narrative until late in life, when historical evidence vindicated his account. The mission's success relied on extraordinary coordination between intelligence services, naval command, and Army aviation. The Navy had decoded the message through the work of cryptanalysts like Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton. Marine Major John Cundon had provided initial mission planning. Army Air Force pilots had executed the intercept. This inter-service cooperation, often lacking in other Pacific operations, proved that unified command could achieve remarkable results. The lessons would influence American military doctrine through the remainder of World War II and into the modern era. Admiral Yamamoto's death represented more than the loss of one commander. His unique understanding of American capabilities had provided Japan's only realistic strategic vision. He alone, among Japanese leaders, truly comprehended American industrial capacity and political will. His famous quote, "I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, but after that, I have no confidence," reflected understanding that Japan could not win a prolonged war, his replacement by commanders who believed in spiritual superiority over material reality accelerated Japan's defeat. The timing of Yamamoto's death. April held special significance exactly 1 year after the Doolittle Raid on Tokyo. American fighters had struck at the heart of Japanese military leadership. The symbolism was intentional and powerful. America could reach out across vast distances to strike specific targets with surgical precision. No Japanese commander was safe. The hunters had become the hunted. The psychological impact rippled through Japanese military leadership, creating hesitation and uncertainty in strategic planning. Technical analysis of the mission revealed both strengths and limitations of American fighter operations. The P-38's range had been pushed to absolute limits. Several aircraft returned with essentially dry tanks, had Yamamoto's flight been delayed by 30 minutes. The American fighters might have exhausted their fuel searching for the target. The margin between success and catastrophe had been measured in gallons of gasoline and minutes of flight time. This razor-thin margin highlighted the need for even longer range fighters and better fuel management systems. The role of weather in the mission's success cannot be overstated. Clear visibility at the intercept point had allowed visual acquisition at maximum range. Scattered cloud cover along the return route had provided concealment from potential Japanese interceptors. A tropical storm anywhere along the route would have forced mission cancellation. The weather gods, as pilots often said, had chosen sides on April 1943. Even a slight wind shift could have doomed the mission. Japanese efforts to conceal Yamamoto's death revealed the magnitude of the loss. For over a month, Japanese propaganda continued to issue statements in Yamamoto's name. His death was finally announced on May 21, 1943, described as occurring while engaging the enemy in the front line. A state funeral on June 5 saw hundreds of thousands of mourners line Tokyo streets. Emperor Hirohito himself attended, an unprecedented honor that reflected Yamamoto's unique status. Part of his ashes were interred at Tama Cemetery in Tokyo, the remainder at his family temple in Nagoya. The American pilots who flew the mission struggled with conflicting emotions. They had succeeded in killing a respected adversary, a man who many acknowledged as a military genius. Yamamoto had opposed war with America, understanding its futility better than those who ordered him to plan it. Yet he had orchestrated Pearl Harbor, making him a legitimate target for retribution. The moral complexity of targeted assassination, even in wartime, troubled some participants for decades afterward. Intelligence officer Edwin Layton, who had urged the mission's approval, later reflected on Yamamoto's death with mixed feelings. He had known Yamamoto personally from pre-war diplomatic functions in the 1930s. Understood that Yamamoto's strategic vision, while dangerous to America, was grounded in realistic assessment rather than militaristic fantasy. Yet Layton also knew that Yamamoto's death would save American lives by disrupting Japanese naval planning. War demanded such terrible choices. The mission demonstrated American technological superiority in multiple dimensions. Code-breaking provided the intelligence, long-range fighters provided the weapon, precise navigation provided the delivery system, but technology alone had not guaranteed success. The human factors, Mitchell's navigation skills, Barbara's marksmanship, the maintenance crew's dedication had transformed technical capability into operational success. The synthesis of human skill and mechanical precision would characterize American military superiority throughout the Pacific War. Post-war analysis revealed how close the mission had come to failure at multiple points. If Lieutenant Canning had not spotted the Japanese formation when he did, the P-38s might have overflown the target. If Barber had not maintained pursuit of the diving bomber, Yamamoto might have escaped into the jungle. If Holmes had not damaged the second bomber, allowing Barbara to complete its destruction, witnesses might have survived to warn of American code-breaking capabilities. Each link in the chain had held but barely. Squadron records revealed the mission's narrow margins in stark detail. Fuel consumption data showed that several aircraft had operated beyond calculated ranges, succeeding only through favorable winds and careful engine management. Ammunition Expenditure reports indicated that Barber had fired approximately 70% of his available rounds during his 2 attack runs. Maintenance logs documented extensive damage to multiple aircraft, testament to the intensity of Japanese defensive fire during those brief combat moments. The strategic implications of Yamamoto's death extended beyond immediate military effects. His absence removed the one Japanese leader who might have negotiated reasonable peace terms as the war turned against Japan. Yamamoto understood that Japan could not win a prolonged war against American industrial might. His successors, lacking his perspective and influence, pursued increasingly desperate strategies that prolonged the war and increased casualties on both sides. The kamikaze tactics that emerged later in the war reflected the strategic bankruptcy that followed Yamamoto's death. Weather records for April 18, 1943, confirmed the exceptional conditions that had enabled mission success. Visibility exceeded 10 miles throughout most of the route. Cloud cover remained scattered rather than solid wind speeds, and directions closely matched forecast values. Such favorable conditions occurred perhaps 1 day in 10 during the Solomon Islands. Typical weather patterns. The mission had launched during a brief window of opportunity that might not have occurred for weeks. The intelligence success that enabled Operation Vengeance relied on hundreds of cryptanalyst translators and analysts working in absolute secrecy at Station Hypo and other facilities. Their contribution to victory often went unrecognized, overshadowed by more visible combat operations. Yet without their patient, meticulous work, the Yamamoto mission would have been impossible. The codebreakers had provided the sword, the pilots had merely wielded it. Technical examination of the crashed Betty bomber revealed the devastating effectiveness of concentrated forward-firing armament. The P-38's 450 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon had created a convergence zone of destruction approximately 30 inches in diameter. At typical combat ranges within this zone, nothing could survive. The bomber's aluminum structure had been shredded. Control cables severed, fuel lines ruptured, and crew killed instantly. No amount of armor could have protected against such concentrated firepower. The Zero escort fighters' failure to protect the bombers highlighted a critical weakness in Japanese tactical doctrine. The escorts had reacted according to training, engaging the attacking fighters rather than maintaining close protection of the bombers. This predictable response had allowed Barber to reach the bombers while Lanphier occupied the Zeros. American fighters would exploit this tactical inflexibility repeatedly in subsequent operations. Admiral Nimitz's decision to authorize the mission had required careful calculation of risks versus benefits. If the mission had failed with heavy losses, it might have revealed American code breaking capabilities while achieving nothing. If publicity had leaked prematurely, the Japanese might have changed their codes entirely. Nimitz had accepted these risks because Yamamoto represented a unique target, a commander whose abilities could not be replaced. History validated his decision. The mission planning process revealed American advantages in staff work and operational planning. Multiple alternatives had been considered and discarded. Contingency plans had been developed for various failure modes. Weather patterns had been analyzed in detail. Fuel consumption had been calculated to the gallon. This methodical approach, combining thorough preparation with tactical flexibility, would characterize successful American operations throughout the Pacific War. The mission's codename Operation Vengeance reflected American emotions regarding Pearl Harbor, yet the pilots who flew the mission reported little sense of personal vengeance. They had executed a military operation with professional detachment. The broader satisfaction of avenging Pearl Harbor belonged to strategic planners and political leaders. For the pilots' survival and mission accomplishment had been satisfaction enough. The mission demonstrated the evolution of American fighter tactics from defensive to offensive operations. Early in the war, American fighters had struggled to protect their own bombers from Japanese interception. By April 1943, American fighters were conducting complex offensive operations deep in Japanese-controlled airspace. This transformation reflected improved aircraft, better training, superior tactics, and growing confidence born from success. The legacy of Operation Vengeance extends beyond its immediate military impact. It demonstrated that individual leadership could still matter in industrialized warfare, that precise intelligence could enable surgical military strikes, that technological superiority meant nothing without the human skills to employ it effectively. These lessons would resonate through subsequent American military operations from Vietnam to the War on Terror. In the final analysis, Operation Vengeance represented American warfare at its most superior technology, guided by precise intelligence, careful planning executed with tactical flexibility, individual excellence within coordinated team effort. The synthesis of these elements had killed Admiral Yamamoto, and with him, Japan's best hope for negotiated peace. The Pacific War would continue for 28 more months, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. April had dawned with 18 American pilots preparing for an impossible mission. It ended with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto dead in the Bougainville jungle, Japan's naval strategy in ruins, and American victory in the Pacific increasingly inevitable. The longest fighter intercept mission in history had achieved its objective through a combination of brilliant planning, superior technology, exceptional flying skills, and extraordinary luck. Operation Vengeance had delivered exactly what its name promised to gain: revenge for Pearl Harbor and the elimination of Japan's most dangerous military mind, the 16 P-38. Lightnings that returned to Guadalcanal that afternoon had changed the course of the Pacific War. Their pilots had flown to the very edge of mechanical and human endurance, fought a brief but decisive battle, and returned to tell the tale. In those few minutes over Bougainville, they had achieved what thousands of bombers and millions of bullets could not: the precise elimination of irreplaceable enemy leadership. The age of strategic assassination had begun, and warfare would never be quite the same.